Asymmetrical Haircuts, Justice Update, with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg.
So what we just heard, Janet, is the improvised emergency klaxon from my press room colleague from AFP. And we kind of hijacked the podcast because you have abandoned me and are on holiday. So I am hijacking the podcast with your favorite person who is also with me in the press room.
Hello, Janet.
We're at the ICJ where they handed down a decision today that the state of Israel must halt its military offensive on the Rafah government. Molly, were you expecting this decision?
I mean, I think we expected that something big was coming. We are back here for the third time. This is the fourth request for provisional measures and the third time that provisional measures have been ordered. And I think kind of the general expectation is we would not be back here unless the judges were kind of willing to go further than they had in the past. And if you had read kind of some of the dissenting opinions, you could sort of see things kind of progressively moving in a direction. But I do think it was, kind of surprising to just see it like in such black and white kind of stark terms that they're just very explicitly telling Israel they have to cease military operations in one city.
Yeah, I always prep for this. So I had a couple of urgents ready. And one of them was like, they order the halt to military action. And the other one was like, they're going to say, don't do it again. And the only way that you can't break the Genocide Convention is to stop military action in Rafah. But in the end, they were super clear. And it was about half an hour done and dusted.
Yeah, it was very fast. We were told ahead by the court that it was going to be very clear. And then we spent a lot of time debating whether or not the court's definition of very clear was our definition of very clear, because often it is not. I think the first order about ceasing military operations is quite clear. And then there is a second one about allowing in UN fact-finding missions or truth-finding commissions. This has been a criticism that Israel is not allowing independent observers into Gaza. And so we don't really have an idea of what's going on there. The court very explicitly said they have to give unimpeded access to the UN. And of course, they also want Israel to report back in a month as to what it's doing to kind of meet these measures.
Yeah, that thing to let all kind of fact-finding inquiry missions. I mean, I think if Karim Khan is listening to that order, he is really rubbing his hands trying to get into Gaza to get evidence. Of course, as the Reuters blurb always says, the court has no way to enforce its rulings, and they have been ignored in the past. I thought it was also interesting that they said that Israel must maintain open the Rafah border crossing to allow humanitarian aid to cross unimpeded. It seems with every subsequent order that we see the judges are getting more and more angry about the humanitarian situation and that it's deteriorating in spite of earlier orders. Could you detect a note of annoyance?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it really seems like they are very frustrated, both that Israel is not listening and that the situation in Gaza is deteriorating. You know, at this point, you're kind of running out of superlatives to describe how bad this situation is. You know, we saw on Monday the ICC prosecutor ask for warrants both for Hamas and Israeli leaders. But the warrants for Israel, I mean, they are directly related to the humanitarian crisis, right? It stems from this accusation of starvation, using starvation as a war crime. And I think the situation in Gaza is just absolutely so dire that, it is essentially impossible to ignore. And you could sort of sense in the way that things were written and how kind of direct and clear they were that, you feel that there must have been some frustration with the discussions going on behind the scenes.
One of the judges, the German judge, asked Israel how, because Israel made the argument that it's evacuating people, it has these humanitarian zone, and he asked for some clarification. And here we'll play a quote from the court president explaining what the court thought of what Israel had provided in information.
The court observed that Israel has not provided sufficient information concerning the safety of the population during the evacuation process, or the availability in Al-Mawasi area of the necessary amount of water, sanitation, food, medicine, and shelter for the 800,000 Palestinians that have evacuated thus far. Consequently, the court is of the view that Israel has not sufficiently addressed and dispelled the concerns raised by its military offensive in Rafah.
Well, it's only been like half an hour ago that this went down. So we're quite happy that it was very clear. I also don't have a lot of extra things to say. Did you look around on Twitter? Did you see any quick reactions?
I mean, I was kind of surprised that people are still paying attention now that we're back here for the third one. I mean, you could compare, I think, to the cases between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which also asked for, intense rounds of provisional measures and also had this very dire situation where essentially there are no ethnic Armenians left in Nagorno-Karabakh, which was what that situation was centered on. By the time you got to the last round, the press room was empty and nobody, kind of was paying attention, and it was hard to get the desk interested in doing any kind of story. Whereas for this, I sort of had so many requests to do TV and radio that I was constantly turning people down because there's just only so many hours in the day. So I think that, kind of in the interest that way. But in some ways it felt sort of expected. Like this wasn't like terribly surprising. I think the decision in January felt kind of surprising, kind of like, maybe it wasn't going to be like this. But I think at least from what I was reading kind of on Twitter a bit, it sort of felt like, everybody kind of expected that it was going to be something like this.
Yeah, I think also on Twitter, a lot of people parsed those earlier separate opinions from the judges on the earlier rulings, where some of them were already saying we should order maybe a halt to military action or a ceasefire. And you could kind of see that maybe this time with the Rafah offensive, this tipped it over the edge. So I also think that at least that's what I prepped for. And it turned out I was right, which is always nice.
Yeah, also I had like a sort of similar pre-write story and was like ready to go. I mean, I didn't have to make a ton of changes. So that was nice to know that you kind of understand what's going to happen. But I do think that there are real questions as to what happens next. Israel has been not adhering to the previous orders, and I don't think that there's any indication out of Israel that it's going to listen to this one. So I do think that there's very valid questions as to what this practically is going to mean on the ground for the civilians who are there.
I also saw from the Israeli judge's separate opinion, he says, this measure requires Israel to halt its military offensive in the Rafah Governorate only insofar as it's necessary to comply with Israel's obligation under the Genocide Convention. His argument is this is a qualified order which preserves Israel's right to, and I quote again, to prevent and repel threats and attacks by Hamas, defend itself, its citizens, and free the hostages. So his interpretation of this is you can still do whatever you're doing as long as you're doing it to defend yourself and your citizens and you're not breaking the Genocide Convention.
I have to say, there was a very similar order made against Russia, also in a case brought under the Genocide Convention. And I did not see a lot of people saying that, like, as long as they were denazifying Ukraine, then it was fine for them to continue the invasion. I mean, it was just clear that you had to cease military activities. So I'm not sure that I think that a lot of people are going to necessarily agree with what the Israeli judge has to say here.
All right, that's it. All that we can think of from this noisy press room. We're going to sign off and we're going to go to the bar after a long week. I'm not sure I can rope in another colleague to make an end sound.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast. Created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. Music is by audionautics.com. And you can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.